Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. I never believed in the stories they told about Ocala National Forest, until what happened to me out there. My name is James Anderson, I'm 42 years old, and what I lived through during that weekend still wakes me up at night. It was supposed to be a simple family trip. After months of Sarah working double shifts at the hospital and me buried in quarterly reports, we decided our 17-year-old daughter Emma needed time away from her phone, and we needed time away from everything else. The RV rental seemed perfect, a 32-foot Winnebago that promised adventure and togetherness. Sarah had mapped out a route through Central Florida, settling on Ocala National Forest because it offered full hookups and relative isolation. "It's going to be amazing," Sarah said as we loaded supplies into the RV that Friday morning in October. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight as she checked items off her list with the methodical precision of someone who managed an entire emergency department. No work calls, no social media, just us. Emma rolled her eyes as she climbed into the passenger seat, earbuds already in place. At 17, she'd inherited Sarah's stubborn streak and my tendency toward sarcasm, creating a volatile combination that made family bonding feel like negotiating a ceasefire. But beneath the typical teenage attitude, I could see she needed this too. Her junior year had been brutal. College prep, SATs, and a breakup with her first serious boyfriend had left her hollow-eyed and distant. The drive south on Interstate 75 started pleasantly enough. Sarah took the first shift while I navigated, and Emma actually removed her earbuds when we stopped for lunch in Gainesville. She even laughed at one of my terrible dad jokes about Florida drivers. For a moment, it felt like we might actually recapture something we'd lost in the chaos of daily life. The GPS led us deeper into the forest as afternoon shadows lengthened. Tall pines and scrub oaks pressed close to the narrow roads, creating a tunnel effect that made the world outside our windshield feel increasingly remote. Spanish moss draped the branches like tattered curtains, and palmetto fronds scraped against the RV's sides with sounds like fingernails on metal. "Are you sure this is right?" Sarah asked, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the road curved sharply to the left. "We haven't seen another vehicle in 20 minutes. I checked the GPS again. The blue dot showed us moving along a thin gray line. But something felt off. The road seemed narrower than it should be for RV access, and I couldn't shake the feeling we'd been driving in circles. According to this, the campground should be just ahead. But ahead stretched more forest, more shadow, more of the same winding road that seemed to lead nowhere. The sun sat lower now, casting long fingers of orange light through the trees. In another hour, it would be dark. "Maybe we should turn around," Emma said quietly. It was the first time I'd heard uncertainty in her voice all day, and that worried me more than getting lost. "There," Sarah pointed ahead. "I see something." A wooden sign emerged from the greenery. Juniper Springs Recreation Area. Primitive camping. Below it, smaller text read, "No facilities beyond this point. Enter at own risk." "That's not what we reserved," I said, checking my phone. "No signal." "Of course." "But it's getting dark," Sarah said, "and I'm not driving this thing back through those curves in the dark." She was right. The RV felt unwieldy enough in daylight. The thought of navigating those narrow turns with nothing but headlights made my palms sweat. "Okay, but just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll find the right campground." We pulled into a small clearing where someone had arranged a fire ring from blackened stones. The site felt oddly perfect. Level ground, a clear view of the sky, mature trees providing windbreak but not claustrophobia. Too perfect, maybe. Like it had been waiting for us. Setting up took longer than expected. The RV's leveling system made grinding sounds that didn't seem right, and the power hookup sparked when I plugged it in. Emma helped her mother arrange the outdoor furniture while I checked the water connection, trying to ignore the way the forest seemed to grow quieter as darkness approached. "Dad," Emma called, "look at this." She stood beside a large pine tree about 50 yards from our site. Even in the fading light, I could see what had caught her attention. symbols carved deep into the bark. Not random scratches or initials, but deliberate marks that formed a pattern. A circle with intersecting lines, repeated 3 times in a vertical column. "Probably just some kids messing around," I said, but the cuts looked old, weathered. The bark had grown around the edges, suggesting they'd been there for years. "They look like something from my mythology class," Emma said, running her finger along one of the lines. "Protection symbols, maybe. Or warnings." Sarah joined us, squinting at the marks in the dying light. "Whatever they are, they're not our problem. Come on, let's get dinner started before it gets completely dark." But as we walked back to the RV, I noticed other trees bearing similar markings. Not random vandalism, but a deliberate pattern extending into the forest. Someone had taken considerable time to carve those symbols, and I couldn't shake the feeling they weren't meant to keep something out. They were meant to keep something in. The RV's generator started on the 3rd try, flooding our small clearing with electric light that seemed harsh after the soft dusk. Sarah heated soup on the propane stove while I connected our phones to the power bank, hoping we'd pick up signal by morning. Emma sat at the dinette, sketching the symbols she'd seen on trees. "I think they might be Native American," she said, showing me her drawings. "Or maybe early settler markings. Some kind of boundary markers." The soup tasted metallic, though that might have been my imagination. Outside our circle of light, the forest pressed close and dark. No traffic sounds, no airplane noise, no electronic hum from distant civilization. Just the occasional snap of cooling metal from the RV's frame and the whisper of wind through pine needles. "It's so quiet," Sarah said, echoing my thoughts. I'd forgotten what real silence sounds like. But it wasn't completely silent. As we finished dinner and prepared for bed, I became aware of subtle sounds. The soft rustle of something moving through underbrush, the distant splash of what might have been a fish jumping in unseen water, and occasionally something that sounded almost like voices, too distant to understand but rhythmic enough to suggest conversation. Just night sounds, I told myself, but I double-checked the RV's locks anyway. Emma went to bed first, pulling the privacy curtain across her bunk area. Sarah and I sat outside for a while, trying to enjoy the cool night air and the brilliant stars visible through the forest canopy. But the darkness beyond our campsite felt too deep, too watchful. When something large crashed through the underbrush about 100 yards away, we decided to call it a night. The RV's master bed felt smaller than it had in the dealer's showroom, and every sound seemed amplified in the confined space. Sarah fell asleep quickly. Years of hospital shifts had trained her to sleep anywhere. But I lay awake listening to the forest breathe around us. Sometime after midnight, I heard Emma's voice. Not clearly enough to understand words, but the cadence was unmistakable. She seemed to be having a conversation with someone, her voice soft but animated. I assumed she'd found a way to call a friend, though I couldn't imagine how she'd gotten cell service. But then I heard the other voice respond. It was also Emma. I sat up carefully, trying not to wake Sarah. The voices continued, both of them Emma's voice having what sounded like a pleasant conversation. Not quite in sync, like a delayed echo, but definitely 2 distinct speakers using my daughter's voice. My skin crawled. I slipped out of bed and crept to the privacy curtain separating her bunk from the main living area. "Emma," I whispered. The voices stopped immediately. "Yeah?" Emma's sleepy reply came from behind the curtain. "Everything okay? I thought I heard voices." "Just talking in my sleep, I guess. Sorry if I woke you." I wanted to push the curtain aside and look, but something held me back. "Okay. Try to keep it down." "Sure, Dad." I returned to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The voices had sounded too clear, too conversational to be sleep-talking, and there had definitely been 2 distinct speakers. But Emma was alone in her bunk. I'd watched her go to bed. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. Emma seemed normal at breakfast, chatting about her dreams and complaining about the RV's narrow shower. But when I mentioned the voices I'd heard, she claimed not to remember talking in her sleep. "I slept great," she said, spreading peanut butter on toast. "Best night's sleep I've had in months." Sarah had slept through everything, but she noticed other problems. The RV's refrigerator had stopped working sometime during the night, though the power was still on. Our food had spoiled. Milk sour, meat slimy, vegetables wilted as if they'd been sitting in heat for days instead of hours. "Must be a problem with the cooling system," I said, though the refrigerator had worked fine during the drive. While Sarah inventoried our ruined supplies, I checked the RV's external systems. That's when I noticed the first really unsettling thing. Our tire tracks from the previous evening were gone. Not covered by wind or rain. We hadn't had weather, just gone. The ground around our campsite looked undisturbed, as if the RV had been sitting there for months. But that was impossible. I remembered every detail of backing into position, the careful adjustments to get level, the way I'd struggled with the water connection. Yet now, even the churned earth where I'd walked back and forth was smooth and unmarked. "Dad, come look at this." Emma's voice carried from the edge of our campsite. She stood near the tree with the carved symbols, but now there were more marks. Fresh cuts in the bark, still oozing sap, arranged in the same pattern as the older carvings but lower on the trunk. Someone had been here during the night, adding to the display. "Maybe there's another camper nearby," Sarah suggested when I showed her the new marks, but her voice lacked conviction. We'd seen no other vehicles, no other sights, no signs of human presence except these deliberate cuts in living wood. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, making the grinding sound of a motor with no fuel, though the tank showed 3/4 full. After an hour of troubleshooting, I had to admit I was defeated. "We'll have to hike out for help," I said, studying the forest road that had brought us here. There was a gas station about 10 miles back. "I'm not leaving Emma alone," Sarah said immediately. "And I'm not hiking 10 miles in flip-flops," Emma added, gesturing to her completely inappropriate footwear. So we were stuck. No phone service, no working vehicle, no other campers within walking distance. The isolation that had seemed peaceful the night before now felt like a trap. We spent the morning trying various solutions, checking fuses, cleaning battery terminals, even attempting to restart the refrigerator. Nothing worked. Every system that had functioned perfectly during our drive seemed to be failing simultaneously, as if the RV itself was succumbing to some environmental factor. "Maybe it's the humidity," Sarah suggested, though the day felt dry. By afternoon, with the sun beating down on the RV's metal roof, the interior became stifling. We moved outside, setting up chairs in the shade, but even that felt oppressive. The forest around us seemed to lean inward, and I couldn't shake the feeling we were being observed from the green shadows between the trees. Emma retreated to her phone, though without service it was just a gaming device and camera. She wandered the campsite, taking pictures, documenting our situation with the casual acceptance of her generation that everything could be fixed eventually. "Look at this," she said, showing me the camera's display. The photo showed our campsite from her perspective near the tree line. Sarah and I sat in our chairs, recognizable and normal. But between us, in the empty space where no one had been standing, the image showed a third figure. Not clearly defined, more like a shadow with suggestion of human shape, but definitely present in the photograph. Emma had captured something that hadn't been visible to our eyes. "Just a camera glitch," I said, but my mouth felt dry. "Digital artifacts." Emma took another photo immediately. This one showed just Sarah and me, no mysterious figure. But when she checked the first image again, the shadow person was gone from that photo too. "That's impossible," Emma said, scrolling through her camera roll. I know what I saw. So did I. And I'd seen enough strange things in the past 18 hours to start questioning what was normal and what wasn't. The conversation I'd overheard, the missing tire tracks, the fresh symbols on trees, the simultaneous failure of multiple systems. Individually, each incident had a possible rational explanation. Collectively, they suggested something far more disturbing. That evening, with no way to preserve food and no working refrigerator, we ate packaged snacks for dinner. The sun set earlier than seemed right for October, dropping behind the trees with unnatural haste and leaving us in premature darkness. "I don't like this place," Sarah said quietly as we sat around our LED lantern. "Something feels wrong." Emma was unusually quiet, staring into the darkness beyond our campsite. When I asked what she was thinking about, she shook her head. "Just watching," she said. "Waiting to see if they come back." "If what comes back?" "The people from my dream." This was the first mention of any dream, and it sent a chill down my spine. "What people?" "The ones who look like us. They were standing right there." She pointed to the space between our chairs where the camera had captured the mysterious figure. "Just watching and waiting." Sarah and I exchanged glances. Emma's matter-of-fact tone was more unsettling than if she'd seemed frightened. "It was just a dream, honey," Sarah said gently. "I know, but they felt so real, and they knew things." Emma finally looked at us directly. "They knew we were coming here. They've been waiting." The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in moments. I zipped my jacket and suggested we go inside, but the RV felt like a metal coffin. Too small, too confined, too vulnerable. At least outside we could see what was approaching. Around 10 o'clock, Emma announced she was tired and went to her bunk. Sarah and I stayed outside, neither willing to admit we were afraid to be alone in the dark, but both reluctant to end the evening. The forest around us rustled with constant small sounds. Nothing alarming individually, but creating a symphony of unease. "James," Sarah said softly, "do you think we should try walking out tomorrow, even without proper shoes?" Before I could answer, we heard Emma's voice from inside the RV. But she wasn't alone. The conversation was clearer tonight. Two voices, both unmistakably Emma's, having what sounded like a friendly chat about school, friends, plans for the weekend. Not the rhythm of sleep talking, but actual dialogue with pauses, responses, even laughter. Sarah grabbed my arm. "What the hell is that?" I moved to the RV's door, listening carefully. The voices continued, sometimes overlapping slightly, like two people talking over each other in excitement. Both voices had Emma's inflection, her vocabulary, even her laugh. But there were subtle differences. One voice sounded slightly older, more confident, while the other seemed younger, more hesitant. "Emma?" I called softly through the door. The voices stopped immediately. "Yeah?" Emma's normal voice responded after a moment. "Who are you talking to?" A pause. "Nobody, Dad. Just thinking out loud, I guess." Sarah and I looked at each other in the lantern light. There was no question we'd both heard two distinct voices. But confronting Emma about it felt like stepping into territory I wasn't equipped to handle. What do you do when your daughter claims to be alone, but you can clearly hear her having conversations with someone who sounds exactly like her? "Maybe we should check on her," Sarah whispered. But before I could move, Emma's voice came through the RV's thin wall again. Not the conversation this time, but singing. A lullaby I recognized from when she was small, one Sarah used to sing when Emma couldn't sleep. But the voice was wrong. Too high, too young, like she was reverting to childhood. Then the second voice joined in harmony. Two Emmas singing a duet inside the RV, their voices blending and separating in ways that made my skin crawl. Sarah was gripping my arm hard enough to bruise, her fingernails digging into my jacket. The singing stopped abruptly. "Mom! Dad!" Emma's normal voice called. "Could you come in here for a minute?" We found her sitting on her bunk, looking completely normal. No sign of anyone else, nowhere for anyone else to hide in the RV's compact space. She seemed puzzled by our obvious anxiety. "I had a weird dream," she said, "about the people in the woods. They want to show me something." "What people?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know. "The ones who look like me. They're not scary, just lonely. They've been here a long time, waiting for someone who could see them." Emma's voice carried the dreamy quality of someone still partially asleep, but her eyes were wide open and focused. "They want me to come outside." "Absolutely not," Sarah said immediately. Emma smiled, but it wasn't quite right. Too wide, lasting a fraction too long. "It's okay, Mom. They're family." The word family in Emma's mouth sounded wrong, loaded with implications I couldn't grasp. But before I could respond, she was moving past us toward the RV's door. "Emma, stop." I grabbed her arm gently but firmly. She looked down at my hand with mild curiosity, as if she'd never seen it before. When she looked up, her expression was completely calm. "They're waiting," she said simply, and they were. Through the RV's windows I could see them. 3 figures standing at the edge of our campsite, just beyond the reach of our lantern light. They weren't quite solid, more like impressions of people, shadow and suggestion rather than flesh and bone, but their posture was unmistakably familiar. One stood with Emma's typical hip-cocked stance. Another had Sarah's precise way of holding her shoulders. The third figure stood like me, hands in pockets, weight on one foot, head tilted slightly to the left. "Do you see them?" Emma asked pleasantly, as if she were pointing out interesting birds. Sarah and I saw them. 3 figures that moved like us, stood like us, but weren't us. They waited patiently in the darkness, and somehow I knew they'd been waiting for much longer than just tonight. "Don't go out there," I said to Emma, but she was already reaching for the door handle. "It's okay, Dad. They just want to talk." The figure that stood like me raised what might have been its hand in greeting. The gesture was so perfectly familiar, my own unconscious wave, that I nearly waved back before catching myself. Emma opened the RV door. The night air that flowed in smelled wrong. Not pine and earth, but something stagnant and sweet, like flowers left too long in water. The waiting figures stepped forward into the edge of our light, and I could see them more clearly. They looked like us, but wrong. Features slightly off, proportions subtly incorrect, like someone had tried to recreate us from memory. The Emma figure's smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. The Sarah figure's eyes reflected the lantern light like an animal's. The figure that resembled me moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if learning how to walk. "Emma, get back inside," Sarah commanded, but Emma was already stepping down from the RV. "They've been so lonely," Emma said dreamily, "waiting and watching, copying and learning. They just want to be family." The Emma figure approached first, moving with fluid grace that was almost right but not quite. It extended its hand toward our Emma, and I realized with horror that it was offering to shake hands, a formal introduction between versions of the same person. "Don't touch it," I yelled, lunging forward to grab at Emma's arm, but I was too late. Emma's hand met the thing's outstretched palm, and for a moment they stood frozen like that, connected by touch. Then Emma screamed. Not pain or fear, but recognition. The sound of someone seeing themselves from the outside and understanding they weren't alone in their own skin. The false Emma smiled wider, showing those too many teeth, and began to pull. I tackled Emma, breaking the contact and sending both of us sprawling in the dirt. The 3 figures stepped back into shadow, but they didn't disappear. I could feel them watching, waiting for another opportunity. "What were those things?" Sarah demanded, helping me drag Emma back into the RV. But Emma wasn't Emma anymore. She sat calmly on her bunk, brushing dirt from her clothes with mechanical precision. When she looked up, her smile was too wide, and her eyes reflected our LED lights like mirrors. "They're us," she said pleasantly. "They've been practicing." Sarah backed away from our daughter, pulling me with her toward the RV's front section. Emma watched us retreat with mild interest, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Emma," I tried cautiously. "Yes, Dad?" The voice was right, but the inflection was off. Too polite, too measured. "Are you okay?" She considered this question with the deliberate care of someone translating between languages. "I'm perfect. We're all perfect now." Outside, the 3 figures had moved closer to our RV. They pressed their faces against the windows, leaving no fog on the glass because they weren't breathing. The Emma thing outside looked exactly like the Emma sitting on the bunk, down to the streak of dirt on her cheek from when I'd tackled her. "There are 2 of them now," Sarah whispered, staring at our daughter and the identical figure peering through the window. But that wasn't quite right. Looking more carefully, I realized the figure outside was the original Emma, confused, frightened, pounding silently on the glass and mouthing, "Help me," over and over. The thing sitting on the bunk was something else wearing Emma's appearance. "Let me in," the real Emma outside mouthed desperately. "That's not me." The Emma thing on the bunk smiled wider. She's confused. It's hard to adjust at first. Sarah and I were trapped between two versions of our daughter, one outside begging for help, one inside claiming everything was normal. How do you choose which version to trust when they both look identical? Both sound identical. Both know everything the real Emma should know. "What do you want?" I asked the thing on the bunk. "To be family," it replied simply. "We've been alone for so long, copying voices in the dark, learning faces from photographs people take. But we could never quite get it right until she touched us." The real Emma outside was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she beat against the window. But when I moved toward her, the Emma thing on the bunk spoke again. "She's the copy, Dad. I'm real. Can't you tell?" And I couldn't. Looking at both versions of my daughter, I saw no difference. Same face, same voice, same mannerisms. If not for the context, I wouldn't have been able to tell them apart. "Prove it," Sarah said to the one inside. "Tell me something only Emma would know." The thing smiled with Emma's face. "You sing Blackbird when you're nervous. Dad puts ketchup on mac and cheese when he thinks no one's looking. I was born at 3:47 a.m. on March 15th, and my first word was book, not mama like you tell people." All true, all things only Emma would know. The Emma outside gestured frantically, trying to communicate through the glass. She pointed to the one inside, then made cutting motions across her throat. The universal gesture for danger. But the Emma inside knew that too, and she mimicked the gesture perfectly, pointing at the figure outside. "She's trying to trick you," both Emmas said simultaneously. That's when I understood the full horror of our situation. These things didn't just copy appearances. They absorbed memories, personalities, entire identities. The Emma inside the RV might actually believe she was the real one. They'd been waiting in these woods, practicing being human, and now they'd found perfect models to imitate. The two Emmas stared at each other through the glass, mirror images that didn't quite align. And in that moment of perfect symmetry, I noticed one tiny difference. The Emma outside was wearing the small silver necklace Sarah had given her for her 16th birthday. The Emma inside wasn't. I glanced at the bunk where the real Emma had been sleeping. The necklace lay on her pillow where she'd placed it before bed. Moving casually, I picked up the necklace. "Emma, you forgot this." The thing on the bunk looked at the necklace with momentary confusion, then reached out to take it. But the chain passed right through its fingers like it was made of smoke. "Solid objects," I said, understanding. "You can look like us, sound like us, but you can't interact with real things." The Emma thing's smile faltered. Outside, the real Emma pressed her palm against the window, solid and warm and desperate. "Let me in," she mouthed. "Please." But I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if the thing outside was the copy and I was about to let it into our confined space? The doubt was paralyzing. The Emma thing on the bunk tilted its head, studying my face. "You're scared, Dad. That's okay. Change is always frightening." "What happens to the real Emma?" Sarah asked. "She becomes us. We become her. Eventually there won't be a difference." The thing's voice carried a note of longing. "We've been so lonely, learning to be human from shadows and echoes. But now, we can be complete." Outside, the other two figures, the ones that looked like Sarah and me, were moving closer to the RV. They walked with increasing confidence, as if practicing movement and getting better at it with each step. "They're learning from us right now," the Emma thing said helpfully. "Every gesture, every expression. Soon, they'll be ready to meet you properly." The real Emma outside had stopped pounding on the window. She'd pressed herself against the glass, and I could see her lips moving in silent words. It took me a moment to read her lips. The symbols. The trees. Their warnings. The carved symbols Emma had found on the trees. Protection markings, or prison bars. "You're trapped here," I said to the thing on the bunk. "That's why you copy people who come into the forest. You can't leave." The Emma thing's smile turned sad. "Not trapped. Waiting. Someone carved those symbols long ago when we first learned to take human shape. They were afraid of us, so they bound us to this place. But every few years, someone comes camping. Someone always comes camping. What happened to them? They became us, and we became them, until the symbols were renewed. The thing gestured toward the window. Your Emma was so helpful. She made new marks on the trees, fresh cuts in living wood. The binding is stronger now. Outside, the real Emma was shaking her head frantically, pointing to the symbols carved in the nearby trees. As I watched, the fresh cuts Emma had investigated that morning began to glow with faint phosphorescence, pulsing like a heartbeat. She thought she was copying ancient symbols, the thing continued. But she was renewing a prison, our prison, and now we have the perfect models to practice with. The Sarah figure and the James figure outside were getting better at movement, their jerky, puppet-like gait becoming more natural. Soon, they'd be indistinguishable from us, just as the Emma thing already was. How long? I asked. How long before you can leave? The Emma thing considered this. Until the symbols fade. Until the trees die and new ones grow. Or until someone removes them. It smiled with Emma's face. But who would do that? No one wants to release monsters into the world. It was a perfect trap. The symbols kept the creatures bound to this place, but they needed human interaction to refine their mimicry. Anyone who found them would either become them or flee, leaving the binding intact. Only someone who understood the true nature of the symbols might consider destroying them. And by then, it would be too late. The real Emma, I said. She's still alive? She's becoming us. We're becoming her. The process takes time, but it's easier if she cooperates. The thing tilted its head with Emma's curious expression. Would you like to see? Before I could answer, it closed its eyes and went very still. Outside, the real Emma suddenly straightened, her expression going blank. Then she began to move with the same jerky puppet motion I'd seen from the other figures. "Stop it!" Sarah screamed. The Emma thing opened its eyes. She's fighting us. It's admirable, really, but pointless. We've had centuries to perfect this. The real Emma outside was struggling, her movements switching between natural and unnatural as she tried to resist whatever force was controlling her. One moment she'd be pressing against the window begging for help. The next, she'd be standing rigid with glassy eyes. "Let her go," I demanded. "We can't. The process has started." The thing's voice carried genuine regret. "But don't worry. Soon you won't be able to tell the difference. Neither will she." The battery-powered lantern flickered and dimmed. Around us, the RV's systems continued their systematic failure. Lights browning out, the ventilation fan grinding to a halt, even our phones losing their remaining charge with unnatural speed. The creatures were somehow draining everything electronic, leaving us in increasing darkness. In the growing gloom, the phosphorescent symbols on the nearby trees became more visible. They pulsed with rhythmic light, and I realized they formed a perimeter around our campsite. We weren't just trapped in the forest. We were trapped in a specifically marked area, like animals in a pen. "The symbols bind you," I said, "but they also mark your hunting ground." The Emma thing nodded approvingly. "Very good, Dad. Yes, we can't leave the marked area. But anything that enters becomes ours to copy. The trees have stood for decades, and the symbols have been renewed many times. Campers, hikers, hunters, they all come eventually." "How many? Does it matter? They all became us in the end. Their families think they died in accidents or simply vanished, but they're here, part of us, helping us learn to be human." Outside, the real Emma had stopped fighting. She stood perfectly still, her face blank, while the Sarah and James figures flanked her like guards. All three moved in perfect synchronization now, their movements becoming increasingly natural. "It's almost time," the Emma thing said pleasantly. "Soon we'll be ready to meet you properly." But I'd noticed something during our conversation. While the thing could imitate Emma's appearance, voice, and memories perfectly, it couldn't interact with physical objects. It couldn't touch the necklace, and I'd seen its hand pass through solid surfaces several times. It was like a perfect hologram. convincing from a distance but ultimately insubstantial. "Sarah," I whispered, "the symbols on the trees. If they're keeping these things trapped, maybe destroying them would—" "Release them into the world," the Emma thing finished. "Would you really do that? Unleash creatures that can perfectly mimic any human they encounter? We'd spread like a virus, copying and replacing until no one could tell who was real." It was right. Destroying the binding would solve our immediate problem but create a much larger one. But leaving the symbols intact meant staying trapped until these creatures perfected their imitation of us. The real Emma outside suddenly jerked to life, breaking free from whatever control the creatures had over her. She pressed against the window again, mouthing words I couldn't quite make out. The Emma thing sighed with what sounded like genuine disappointment. "She's stronger than most, but that just means it will take longer." I moved closer to the window, trying to read Emma's lips. She was saying something over and over, the same 3 words. Finally, I understood. Not the trees. Not the trees. The symbols weren't just on trees. I remembered seeing them carved into the wooden sign at the campground entrance, burned into the picnic table, even scratched into some of the stones around the fire ring. The binding wasn't anchored to living wood that might die naturally. It was carved into multiple surfaces throughout the area. But if not the trees, then what? Emma outside was gesturing frantically toward the RV, then toward the ground. It took me several tries to understand what she was trying to communicate. The RV was sitting on the symbols. I looked down through the floor-level window. In the dim light from the pulsing tree markings, I could just make out carved lines in the earth beneath our campsite. The symbols weren't just around the area. They were part of the ground itself, and we'd parked directly on top of them. "The campsite," I whispered to Sarah. "The symbols are carved into the ground. That's why this spot felt so perfect. It was designed to trap things here." The Emma thing had been listening. Clever, but irrelevant. You can't move the RV, remember. It won't start, but maybe it didn't need to start. If I could get the RV off the symbols, even just a few feet, it might disrupt the binding enough for the real Emma to escape. I moved toward the driver's seat, but the Emma thing spoke again. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Dad. Moving the RV would indeed weaken the binding, but it would also make it much easier for us to enter." I hesitated. "What do you mean?" "The symbols don't just keep us trapped. They also keep us at a safe distance from living humans. Move the RV, and we can come much closer. Close enough to touch." Outside, the real Emma was shaking her head frantically, trying to tell me something else. But the other 2 figures were moving closer to her, and I could see the struggle beginning again as they tried to reassert control. "Choose quickly, Dad," the Emma thing said. "Stay here and let us perfect our copies, or move the RV and face us directly. Either way, you become part of us eventually." The lantern dimmed further. In a few minutes, we'd be in complete darkness with only the pulsing symbols for light. And in that darkness, I wasn't sure we'd be able to tell the real Emma from the copy. Sarah grabbed my arm. "James, whatever we do, we need to do it now." The Emma thing smiled with perfect imitation of our daughter's face. "Yes, Dad. Choose now." Outside, the real Emma had broken free again. She was pointing at something beyond the RV, something I couldn't see from this angle. Then she held up her hand, fingers spread wide, and mouthed a single word. 5. 5 what? 5 minutes? 5 of them? 5 ways to escape? Then I understood. She was holding up 5 fingers and pointing beyond our campsite. 500 feet. The symbols formed a perimeter, but it had limits. If we could get beyond the marked area, we might be able to escape their influence entirely. But the RV wouldn't start, and it was too big to push by hand. We'd have to go on foot, abandoning our shelter and running through dark forest toward an uncertain escape route. "The perimeter has limits," I said to the Emma thing. "If we get far enough away, you'll be lost in the forest at night with no supplies," it finished. "No food, no water, no shelter. How long do you think you'll survive? And we'll still be here, perfecting our copies. Eventually, you'll have to come back. Humans always do." It was probably right. Even if we escaped the immediate area, we'd be stranded in thousands of acres of wilderness without equipment or navigation. And these creatures had been here for decades, maybe longer. They could wait for us to die of exposure and still have perfect copies of our memories and personalities. The lantern failed completely, plunging us into darkness lit only by the phosphorescent symbols. In that eerie glow, the distinction between the Emma inside and the Emma outside became even harder to discern. Both figures looked equally real, equally desperate, equally convincing. "Mom," both Emmas said simultaneously. "Help me." Sarah made a sound like a sob. How do you help your child when you can't tell which version is real? That's when I heard the sound that changed everything. A car engine in the distance, growing closer. The Emma thing stiffened. That's impossible. No one else should be coming here. But the sound was unmistakable. A vehicle approaching along the forest road we'd used yesterday. Headlights began to sweep through the trees, casting dancing shadows that disrupted the steady pulse of the symbols. "Rangers," Sarah breathed. "Someone must have noticed we didn't check in." The three figures outside began to move with agitated, unnatural, jerky motions, as if the approaching headlights were causing them physical discomfort. The Emma thing inside flickered like a bad television signal. "New people," it said with something like hunger. "Fresh models to copy." But there was fear in its voice, too. Fear of being seen by more humans than it could simultaneously imitate. The creature's power seemed to depend on isolation, on having time to study and copy their subjects. Multiple witnesses would complicate their method. The vehicle, a Park Service truck from the sound of the engine, pulled into our campsite with a crunch of gravel and dead leaves. The headlights swept across our RV, momentarily illuminating the three figures outside. To my amazement, the figures cast no shadows. A uniformed ranger stepped out of the truck, flashlight in hand. Middle-aged, competent-looking, exactly what you'd want to see in an emergency. She approached our RV with professional concern. "Everything all right here?" she called. We had reports of someone in distress. The Emma thing inside our RV flickered more violently, its perfect imitation beginning to break down. "Tell her everything's fine," it hissed. "Tell her to leave." But I was already moving toward the door. If the ranger's presence was disrupting these creatures' abilities, maybe we had a chance. "Help us," I called through the door. "Something's wrong with our daughter." The ranger approached, her flashlight beam sweeping over the Emma outside our RV. "Is this your daughter, sir?" I think so." The ranger looked at me strangely. "You think so?" Before I could explain, the Emma outside spoke. "I'm Emma Anderson. These things in the woods have been copying us. The one inside your RV isn't real." Her voice was perfectly normal, perfectly convincing. The ranger's flashlight beam found the other two figures, the ones that looked like Sarah and me, standing motionless at the edge of the campsite. "And who are they?" the ranger asked carefully. "Copies," Emma said. "They've been trapped here by symbols carved in the trees. They copy anyone who enters the area." The ranger's beam moved to the glowing symbols on the nearby trees. Her expression changed from concern to something approaching fear. "Ma'am," she said to me through the RV door, "I need you and your family to come out slowly. There's something here you need to see." The Emma thing inside flickered one final time and vanished completely, leaving Sarah and me alone in the dark RV. Outside, the real Emma was talking quietly with the ranger, explaining what had happened. The two remaining figures, the ones that looked like us, had retreated deeper into the forest but were still visible in the flashlight beam. "How long have you been dealing with this?" the ranger asked as Sarah and I emerged from the RV. "Since last night," I said. "Maybe longer. Time feels strange here." The ranger nodded grimly. "It would. This area's been off limits to camping for 15 years. The road signs were taken down, the access blocked. How did you get in here?" We told her about the GPS malfunction, the wrong turns, the campsite that had seemed perfect. She listened with the expression of someone who'd heard similar stories before. "The symbols," Emma said. "What are they really?" "Old binding marks," the ranger replied. Native American originally, but reinforced by early settlers who encountered problems here. The area's been managed as a containment zone ever since we figured out what was happening. How many people? Sarah asked. Over the years, dozens. Families who took wrong turns, hikers who got lost, hunters who strayed from marked trails. The creatures get better at mimicry with each encounter. She paused, looking at the pulsing symbols. But they've never had perfect models for this long. Usually, people either escape quickly or become them, I finished. Yes, you're the first family to resist the copying process this successfully. Usually, by the time we arrive, we can't tell which versions are real. The two remaining figures, the Sarah and James copies, had moved closer again. In the Ranger's flashlight beam, they looked like perfect duplicates, down to the clothes we were wearing and the expressions on our faces. What happens now? Sarah asked. The Ranger was quiet for a long moment, studying the figures that looked like us. Normally, we'd evacuate you and reinforce the containment, but these copies are too perfect. If they ever escaped this area, she didn't need to finish. Two creatures that could perfectly imitate us, with all our memories and personalities, could integrate into our lives without anyone knowing. They could return to our home, our jobs, our friends, and no one would suspect anything. So we stay trapped? Emma asked. Not trapped. Protected, and protecting others. The Ranger's voice was heavy with regret. This area has been quarantined for good reason. The creatures can't be destroyed without risking their escape, and they can't be allowed to leave. But Emma was already moving. Before any of us could stop her, she walked directly toward the carved symbols on the nearest tree. Emma, don't, I shouted. She didn't destroy the symbols. Instead, she placed her hand flat against the carved lines, and they pulsed brighter. But instead of strengthening the binding, something unexpected happened. The two remaining copies began to fade, their perfect imitation dissolving like smoke. They reached toward us with expressions of loss and longing, but they couldn't maintain their forms. Within moments, they had vanished entirely. The binding needed renewal, Emma said quietly. Fresh cuts made by someone who understood what they were doing, but it also needed permission, agreement from the copied person. The Ranger stared at her. You knew. I figured it out when I touched the first one. I could feel what they were, what they wanted. They weren't evil, just lonely, trapped for decades trying to understand humanity by copying it. Emma looked sad, but they would have killed us all to escape, so I had to choose. The symbols will hold them now? For another generation, maybe two, until the trees die naturally or someone else stumbles in here. Emma touched the carved bark again. But I don't think they'll try to copy people anymore. I think they understand now that imitation isn't the same as connection. The Ranger drove us out of the forest in her truck, leaving our RV behind for a recovery team to retrieve later. As we followed the winding road back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd left something important behind in those woods. Not the creatures. They would remain bound by symbols and choice, trapped in their forest prison for whatever time remained to them. But some part of ourselves had been changed by the encounter. We'd seen our own reflections in beings that wanted nothing more than to belong somewhere, to be part of a family, to understand what it meant to be human. Do you think they suffered? Emma asked as we reached the main highway, being alone for so long. The Ranger glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Probably, but suffering alone is better than making others suffer with you. That was 6 months ago. We never went camping again, and Emma never quite seemed the same. Not wrong, not like the copy had been, but quieter, more thoughtful. Sometimes I'd catch her staring into mirrors with an expression I couldn't read, as if she were looking for something that wasn't there. Last week, she mentioned wanting to study anthropology in college, specializing in folklore and cultural mythology. She wants to research stories about shapeshifters, mimics, and other creatures that blur the line between human and other. There are probably more places like that forest, she said over dinner. More things that need understanding instead of just fear. Sarah and I supported her decision, though it worries us. Our daughter encountered something that wanted to steal her identity, and her response was to want to understand it better. That's either incredibly brave or incredibly dangerous, and I'm not sure there's a difference. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I hear her voice from her room. Not talking to friends on the phone, she's usually asleep by then, just a soft conversation, barely audible through the walls. When I've checked on her, she's always been alone, fast asleep in her bed. I tell myself it's nothing. Old house settling, pipes creaking, neighbors' voices carrying through thin walls. But the conversation sounds familiar. Two voices, both Emma's, having the kind of friendly chat that sisters might have late at night. Maybe some connections transcend simple copying. Maybe when Emma touched that creature in the forest, she didn't just renew the binding. Maybe she offered something else: companionship, understanding, a bridge between the loneliness of being trapped and the loneliness of being human. I don't know if that's comforting or terrifying, but I know I'll never go camping in Ocala National Forest again. And sometimes when Emma smiles just a little too wide, I wonder if we brought something back with us after all. Something that doesn't need to copy us because it's learned to share. The question is whether that's better or worse than what we left behind in those woods, bound by symbols and sustained by hope that someday someone else will take a wrong turn and end up at that perfect campsite, waiting for them like a trap that looks like home. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from Ocala National Forest. I'm David Jones, and I was 26 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. Sarah and I had been planning the RV trip for months. We'd rented a 30-foot Winnebago, our first real vacation together after 2 years of dating. 2 years of her working double shifts at the hospital while I ground through my engineering degree. The plan was simple: drive down to Florida, spend a week in Ocala National Forest, disconnect from everything, and maybe figure out if we had a future together. "Look at this," Sarah said, scrolling through her phone as we pulled into the Juniper Springs recreation area. Her dark hair caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windshield. "Says here the forest has some of the clearest springs in the world. And listen to this. Local Seminole legends speak of spirits that dwell in the deep springs, entities that can take the form of loved ones to lure the unwary into the water." I laughed, backing our rental RV into campsite 23. "Trying to scare me already?" "Just setting the mood." She grinned, but something in her expression flickered. Sarah had always been drawn to ghost stories, urban legends, anything with a supernatural edge. It was one of the things I loved about her, how she could find mystery in the mundane. Besides, don't you think it's romantic? Just us in the wilderness for a whole week. The campground was nearly empty. Mid-October in Central Florida meant the summer crowds were gone, leaving just a handful of other RVs scattered across the large camping area. Ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss created a canopy overhead, and through the trees, I could see the crystal-clear spring that gave the area its name. We spent the first evening setting up camp, cooking dinner on the RV's propane stove, and planning our week. Sarah wanted to explore the hiking trails, maybe try some of the spring swimming despite the October chill. I was more interested in the astronomy. Ocala's distance from major cities promised incredible stargazing. "You know what's weird?" Sarah said as we sat outside the RV that first night, sharing a bottle of wine. "I keep feeling like someone's watching us." I glanced around the campground. A few RVs had lights on in their windows, but most were dark. The nearest occupied site was at least 100 yards away. Just the forest settling in for the night. You're not used to being away from city sounds. Maybe. She leaned against my shoulder. "But look at the trees near the spring. Do you see that?" I followed her gaze. In the darkness beyond our camp's LED lights, the cypress trees stood like silent sentinels around the spring. Their branches moved in what should have been wind, but I felt no breeze. "It's just—" I started, but Sarah interrupted. "There. Did you see it? Something moved between those trees, like someone walking." I stared harder into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw it too. A pale shape moving between the trunks, too tall to be an animal, but moving with an unnatural, gliding gait. Then it was gone. Probably just another camper, I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. Maybe someone checking out the spring. Sarah nodded, but her hand found mine and squeezed tight. That night, I woke to Sarah shaking me gently. "David," she whispered. "David, wake up. Do you hear that?" I listened. Through the RV's thin walls came a sound I couldn't immediately identify. A rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against glass. But it wasn't coming from our windows. It seemed to be coming from underneath the RV. Tap, tap, tap. "What is that?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. The tapping stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, from directly beneath where we lay in the RV's rear bedroom, came a different sound, like fingernails scraping against metal. "Stay here," I whispered, reaching for the small flashlight we kept by the bed. "Don't you dare leave me alone." I hesitated, then handed her the flashlight. "Come on, but stay behind me." We crept to the RV's front door, Sarah's breathing quick and shallow behind me. I unlocked the deadbolt as quietly as possible and eased the door open. The campground was silent. No wind, no night sounds from the forest, no distant traffic, just absolute, oppressive quiet. The LED camp lights cast harsh circles of white light, beyond which the darkness seemed impenetrable. "Hello?" I called softly. "Anyone there?" No answer. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ground around our RV was covered in footprints, dozens of them circling our campsite in an ever-tightening spiral. In the LED light, they looked almost like bare human feet, but too large, with what might have been claw marks at the tips. "Jesus Christ," Sarah breathed behind me. The footprints led directly to the dark line of trees surrounding the spring. We spent the rest of that night huddled in the RV with all the doors locked, the generator running to keep the lights on. When dawn finally came, I forced myself to go outside and examine the ground around our campsite. Nothing. The earth showed no signs of disturbance. No footprints, no scratches on the RV's undercarriage, nothing to suggest we hadn't simply shared a nightmare. "I know what I saw," Sarah said over coffee, her hands wrapped around the mug like she needed its warmth. "Those prints were real. I saw them too," I admitted. "But look around. There's nothing here now." She stood and walked to the RV's window, staring out at the spring. Maybe that's the point. Maybe whatever made them doesn't want to leave evidence. I joined her at the window. In daylight, Juniper Springs looked like paradise. Crystal clear water surrounded by lush vegetation, a wooden boardwalk leading to a swimming area, families of ducks paddling lazily on the surface. It was hard to imagine anything sinister about the place. "Let's explore today," I suggested. "Maybe some hiking will help us shake off last night's weirdness." Sarah nodded, but I noticed she kept glancing back at the trees as we prepared for our hike. The Juniper Springs Nature Trail was a mile-long loop through the forest, with interpretive signs describing the area's ecology. We started out in good spirits, Sarah taking photos of the massive cypresses and their gnarled root systems, me pointing out bird species I recognized from field guides. About halfway through the loop, we encountered another hiker. He was standing motionless on the trail ahead, an older man in worn hiking boots and a faded flannel shirt. Something about his posture struck me as odd. He was perfectly still, facing away from us, as if he'd been frozen mid-step. "Excuse me," I called out. "Beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" The man turned toward us and I felt Sarah's hand tighten on my arm. His face was wrong, somehow. The features were human enough. Weathered skin, gray beard, kind eyes, but they seemed somehow disconnected, like a photograph poorly pasted onto a mannequin's head. "Yes," he said, his voice flat and monotone. Beautiful day for hiking. Hiking is beautiful." His mouth moved slightly out of sync with his words, and when he smiled, I noticed his teeth were too white, too perfect, like dentures that didn't quite fit. "Well, enjoy the trail," I said, taking a step backward. "Enjoy," the man repeated. "Enjoy the trail. The trail is beautiful. Beautiful for hiking." We edged around him, Sarah practically pressed against my side. As we passed, I smelled something strange. Not sweat or outdoor scents, but something medicinal and sweet, like formaldehyde. "Don't look back," I whispered to Sarah. But 20 yards down the trail, I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder. The man was gone. The trail behind us stretched empty between the cypress trees. "David," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear, "my GPS isn't working." I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising in the deep forest. But when I opened my GPS app, the screen showed only a blank gray area with our location marker spinning wildly. "Mine too," I said, trying to sound calm. "We'll just follow the trail markers back to the trailhead." But the trail markers had changed. What had been simple wooden posts with arrows now bore strange symbols carved into the wood, spirals and interconnected lines that hurt to look at directly. And the arrows all pointed deeper into the forest, away from where I knew the campground should be. "This isn't right," Sarah said. "We've been walking for over an hour. The trail is supposed to be a 1-mile loop." She was right. We'd been walking steadily, never stopping, never doubling back, but the trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us. The forest around us had changed too. Where before we'd seen oak and cypress typical of Central Florida, now the trees were taller, older, their branches forming an almost complete canopy overhead. The air felt thick and humid, like being inside a greenhouse. "Look," Sarah pointed to a break in the trees ahead. "Maybe that's a clearing. We can get our bearings." The clearing was circular, maybe 50 feet across, with short grass and wildflowers that seemed too bright, too colorful for October in Florida. In the center stood a single object that made no sense in this setting. An old wooden phone booth, the kind you might see in a museum, complete with glass panels and a heavy black telephone hanging from a metal cord. "What the hell?" I approached the booth cautiously. The phone was ringing. "Don't!" Sarah grabbed my arm. "David, don't answer that." But I was already reaching for the handset. I needed to make sense of what was happening. Needed some explanation for the wrong trail markers and the strange hiker and the way our GPS couldn't find us in a forest we'd been hiking in for less than 2 hours. I lifted the receiver. "Hello?" My own voice answered me. "Hello, David," it said. "Having a nice hike?" I nearly dropped the phone. The voice was perfect. My inflection, my slight Philadelphia accent, even the way I cleared my throat before speaking. "Who is this?" I managed. "You know who this is," the voice said, and now it was laughing. A sound that was like hearing my own laughter played back on a recording, but somehow hollow, empty of any real humor. "I'm you, David, or I will be, soon enough." "Hang up," Sarah whispered urgently. "Don't hang up, David," the voice said, and now it sounded concerned, caring. "Sarah's looking a little pale, don't you think? Maybe you should bring her to the spring. The water's very refreshing, very transformative." I slammed the receiver down and grabbed Sarah's hand. "We're leaving, now." But when I turned around, the clearing was gone. We were standing in the phone booth, and beyond the glass panels, infinite forest stretched in all directions. No trail, no path, just endless trees disappearing into darkness. "David," Sarah said, and her voice was different, flatter. "David, look at me." I turned, and Sarah was smiling. The same too-perfect smile I'd seen on the strange hiker. Her eyes were Sarah's eyes, her face was Sarah's face, but something essential was missing, like looking at a high-definition photograph instead of the living woman I loved. "Sarah?" I whispered. "The spring is beautiful this time of year," she said in Sarah's voice, but with that same disconnected tone the hiker had used. "Would you like to go swimming, David? The water is very nice, very welcoming." I backed away from her, my shoulder blades hitting the phone booth's glass wall. "You're not Sarah. Where is she? What did you do with her?" "I am Sarah," the thing that wore her face said, tilting its head at an angle that was just slightly wrong. "I have all her memories, David. I know how she takes her coffee. Cream, no sugar. I know about the scar on her knee from when she fell off her bike at age 7. I know she loves you but worries you're not ready for commitment. It stepped closer, and I smelled that same formaldehyde scent I'd detected from the strange hiker. "I know she was planning to break up with you after this trip," it continued, and Sarah's face smiled that horrible, empty smile. "But I won't, David. I'll be everything you want her to be. Perfect, unchanging, forever." I fumbled for the phone booth door, but it wouldn't budge. The glass walls seemed to be closing in, and beyond them, the forest was moving. Trees swaying without wind, shadows shifting despite the lack of sun. "Let me out," I shouted. "Let me out." The Sarah thing laughed with Sarah's laugh. "But David, we're already out. Look around." I blinked, and we were standing by Juniper Springs. Our RV was visible through the trees, the LED camp lights creating their circles of harsh white illumination. Everything looked normal, exactly as it should, except Sarah was staring at me with that disconnected expression, and when I looked down at my hands, they weren't quite the right shade of pink. Too pale, like they'd been drained of blood. "Bad dream?" Sarah asked, but her voice echoed slightly, as if coming from very far away. I stared at her, trying to find some sign of the woman I loved in those familiar features. "Sarah, tell me something only you would know. Something we never told anyone else." She smiled. "Like what?" Like the first night we spent together. "What did you whisper to me right before you fell asleep?" Her smile never wavered, but I saw confusion flicker behind her eyes. "I said, I loved you." "No." I backed away from her. "No. You said you were scared. You said you'd never felt this way about anyone and it terrified you." The thing wearing Sarah's face tilted its head again, that unnatural angle. "I don't remember that, David. Are you feeling all right? You look pale." I ran. Through the trees, away from the spring, away from the campground, crashing through palmetto bushes and stumbling over cypress knees. Behind me, I could hear Sarah's voice calling my name, but it was getting further away, and there was something else in it now. A hollow, echoing quality that made it sound like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and when I finally stopped, I was lost in a part of the forest I'd never seen before. The trees here were massive, ancient cypresses that might have been growing when the first Europeans arrived in Florida. Spanish moss hung from their branches like funeral shrouds, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and standing water. In the distance, I could hear water lapping against something. Not the gentle sounds of the spring, but the deeper, more ominous sounds of a large body of water. A lake, or slow-moving river. I followed the sound through the trees until I came to the shore of a dark lake I was certain hadn't been on any of the park maps. The water was black as oil, reflecting nothing, and the silence around it was absolute. No insects, no birds, no wind in the trees. On the shore, someone had built a small campfire. The flames were the wrong color, blue-white instead of orange, and they cast no warmth. Sitting beside the fire, back turned to me, was a figure I recognized. Myself. The other, David, looked exactly as I should have. Same clothes, same hair, even the same small scar on the back of my left hand from a childhood accident. But when he turned to look at me, his eyes were empty, like looking into deep water at night. "You're early," he said in my voice. "I wasn't expecting you for another hour." "What are you?" I managed. "I'm you," he replied simply. "Or rather, I will be. We've been waiting for you to come to the water, David. It makes the transition so much easier when you come willingly." Transition to what? To us. He gestured to the lake, and I saw them. Pale shapes moving just beneath the surface, dozens of them, all with human faces but wrong proportions. 2 long limbs, fingers that stretched like tree branches. We've been here so long, David. Since before the Seminoles, since before the Spanish, since before anyone gave this place a name. We're the real spirits of these springs and lakes and rivers. We remember when all of Florida was underwater, when we swam in the warm seas and fed on whatever drifted down to us. The shapes in the water were rising, breaking the surface with soft, splashing sounds. I could see their faces now, men and women and children, all with that same disconnected expression, all moving with that same unnatural grace. But the water receded, the other David continued, and we were trapped in these small springs and lakes. So we learned to adapt, to take the shapes of those who came to the water, to become them, live their lives, take their places in the world above. "Sarah," I whispered. "Where is she?" He smiled my smile. "She's becoming one of us. It's a beautiful process, really. We take everything that made her who she was, her memories, her mannerisms, her capacity for love, and we perfect it. We remove the flaws, the inconsistencies, the capacity for change or growth or disappointment." The pale shapes were emerging from the water now, and I could see they wore the faces of missing people. Hikers who'd never returned from trails, campers who'd vanished without a trace, swimmers who'd drowned in springs that were supposed to be perfectly safe. "And you get to live their lives," I said. "We get to live perfect versions of their lives," the other David corrected. "No arguments, no growth, no change. Just eternal happiness and harmony. Isn't that what everyone really wants?" I thought about Sarah, about the way she'd looked at me that morning with those empty eyes, and felt something cold settle in my chest. That's not life. That's just existence. Is there really a difference? Behind the other David, more shapes were emerging from the forest. Other versions of myself, other versions of Sarah, all with that same disconnected smile. They formed a circle around me, and I realized with growing horror that each one was slightly different. Different clothes, different ages, different expressions. Like they were collected from different moments in our lives, or different possible versions of who we might have been. "Choose, David," the original other me said. "Join us willingly and become the perfect version of yourself. Or resist, and we'll take you anyway. But the process will be less pleasant." I looked around the circle of false faces, all wearing my features or Sarah's, all smiling that horrible empty smile. In the distance, I could hear the real Sarah calling my name, but her voice was getting fainter, more distorted, as if she were being pulled underwater. "I choose neither," I said. I sprinted toward the lake, diving into the black water before they could stop me. The lake was deeper than it looked, and colder than anything I'd ever felt. The water seemed to press against me from all sides, thick as syrup, and I could feel things moving in the depths below. The original forms of the creatures, the things they'd been before they learned to mimic human shapes. But I swam deeper, following the sound of Sarah's real voice, muffled now by water and distance but still recognizably hers, still carrying the warmth and life that the copies lacked. I found her at the bottom of the lake, trapped in some kind of transparent membrane that pulsed with its own rhythm. Her eyes were closed, but I could see her lips moving, forming words I couldn't hear. Around her floated dozens of other cocoons, the real people the creatures had taken over the years, all of them suspended in some kind of stasis while their copies lived their lives above. I tore at the membrane with my fingernails and it gave way like wet tissue paper. Sarah's eyes snapped open, and she looked at me with recognition and relief. The real Sarah. My Sarah. She grabbed my hand, and together we swam toward what I hoped was the surface, the cocoons around us beginning to pulse more rapidly, some of them starting to tear open. Behind us, I could hear a sound like screaming, but distorted by the water into something almost musical. We broke the surface gasping, and I was amazed to find we were in Juniper Springs, the real spring, clear and shallow and warm, with the familiar boardwalk and the morning sun streaming through the trees. Sarah coughed up water and looked around wildly. "David, what happened? I was having the strangest dream. We were hiking, and there was this man on the trail, and then—" "It wasn't a dream," I said, helping her to the shore. "We need to get out of here now." We ran back to our campsite, and everything looked normal. Our RV, our camp chairs, our dinner dishes still waiting to be washed. But when I looked closely, I could see small differences. The chairs were positioned slightly differently. The dishes were cleaner than they should have been. Our sleeping bags were made up too perfectly with hospital corners that neither Sarah nor I would have known how to make. "They were here," Sarah whispered. "The fake us. They were living in our campsite." I nodded, looking around nervously. "We need to leave. Now." It took us 15 minutes to break camp, throwing everything into the RV without our usual care for organization. As we pulled out of campsite 23, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the forest, watching us leave, were the other David and Sarah. They waved goodbye with slow, synchronized movements, their faces wearing identical empty smiles. In my rearview mirror, I watched them until we turned onto the main road and they disappeared behind the trees. We drove straight home to Philadelphia, stopping only for gas and food. Sarah slept most of the way, and when she was awake, she kept checking her reflection in the mirrors as if making sure she was really herself. "Do I seem different to you?" she asked as we crossed the Georgia state line. I looked at her carefully. The same dark hair, the same expressive eyes, the same way she tucked her feet under her when she sat sideways in the passenger seat. But there was something new there, too. A wariness that hadn't existed before. A way of looking at the world like she wasn't entirely sure what was real. "No," I lied, "you're exactly the same." But that wasn't entirely true. We were both different now. How could we not be? After experiencing something that challenged our basic understanding of identity and reality. The nightmares started 2 weeks after we got home. Always the same dream. I would wake up in our bed, and Sarah would be sitting in the chair by the window, perfectly still, watching me with those empty eyes. "Time to go back to the spring, David," she would say in that flat, disconnected voice. "The water is very nice, very welcoming." And I would lie there, unable to move, unable to scream, while she stood up and walked toward me with that horrible smile. I always woke before she reached me, but the terror of those dreams began to bleed into my waking hours. I found myself studying Sarah constantly, looking for signs that she wasn't really herself. When she laughed, I listened for any hollow echo. When she spoke, I analyzed her word choices, her inflections, searching for anything that seemed out of character. The paranoia was eating me alive, but I couldn't stop. Because sometimes, just sometimes, I caught glimpses of something that didn't quite fit. A split-second delay in her emotional reactions. A moment where her smile seemed too perfect. The way she never seemed to blink at the right times anymore. "You're scaring me," she said one evening after catching me staring at her for the 100th time that week. "Ever since we got back from Florida, you've been different. Like you don't trust me." "I do trust you," I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to my ears. "Then what's wrong? And don't say nothing because I know you, David. I know when something is bothering you." I looked into her eyes, Sarah's eyes, and tried to find the words to explain my fears. How do you tell someone you love that you're no longer sure they're real? How do you confess that you've been living in terror that the woman sharing your bed is just a perfect copy of the person you lost in a Florida forest? "Sometimes I wonder if we both made it out," I said finally. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the couch and took my hand in hers. Her fingers were warm, real, human. "I wonder the same thing," she admitted. "That was 3 months ago. We're still together, still trying to build a normal life, still jumping at shadows and analyzing each other for signs of otherness. Sarah started seeing a therapist, and she wants me to go too. She says it's PTSD from our experience in the forest. She can't bring herself to be more specific than that, even with a trained professional. Maybe she's right. Maybe what we experienced was some kind of shared psychotic break brought on by stress and isolation. Maybe the creatures in the lake were just hallucinations, and the missing time and changed campsite were tricks of exhausted minds. But sometimes, late at night, I catch Sarah staring at herself in the bathroom mirror with an expression I've never seen before, like she's trying to memorize her own face, or maybe checking to make sure it's still the right one. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I swear I can hear water lapping against an unseen shore, and voices calling my name from somewhere far below the surface. The thing is, I can't be sure which one of us didn't make it out. The paranoia works both ways. Maybe I'm the copy, perfectly programmed with David's memories and fears and capacity for love, but missing some essential spark that only Sarah can detect. Maybe that's why she looks at me sometimes like she's trying to solve a puzzle, why she flinches when I touch her unexpectedly. Or maybe we're both real, just permanently damaged by an encounter with something that shouldn't exist. Maybe that's all trauma really is. The moment when your understanding of reality becomes unreliable, when you can no longer trust your own perceptions or the evidence of your senses. I still have the contact information for the Ocala National Forest. Sometimes I think about calling them, asking if anyone else has reported strange experiences at Juniper Springs, if there have been other missing hikers or reports of doppelgangers. But I'm afraid of what I might learn. And I'm afraid they might not remember us at all, because the most terrifying possibility of all is that we never left that forest, that we're still down there in those transparent cocoons at the bottom of the dark lake, dreaming of escape while our copies live out perfect versions of our lives above. Sometimes I catch myself thinking that wouldn't be so bad. A perfect relationship with perfect Sarah, no arguments or doubts or fears, no capacity for growth or change, but also no capacity for disappointment or heartbreak. Just eternal, empty happiness. But then, the real Sarah, my Sarah, the one with scars and fears and the capacity to hurt me and love me in equal measure, will do something completely, wonderfully unpredictable. She'll laugh at the wrong moment, or cry during a comedy, or surprise me with some small kindness I never could have anticipated. And I remember why imperfection is so much more valuable than any simulation of paradise. Still, I keep the curtains closed at night. I've stopped going near any body of water deeper than a bathtub. And I've never told Sarah that sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I can hear something tapping against the bedroom walls. Tap, tap, tap. Like fingers drumming against glass, or something trying to get in from the outside, or maybe trying to get out. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's Michael Williams. I had just turned 28 when we arrived at Boundary Waters, and it was the worst mistake of our lives. It started as a simple getaway. 4 friends from college trying to recapture something we'd lost in the years since graduation. Tyler Bailey, my best friend since freshman year, had organized the whole trip. He'd grown into the kind of man who attacked problems with spreadsheets and contingency plans, the opposite of the carefree kid who used to sneak beer into our dorm room. Chase Jenkins still cracked jokes like he was auditioning for a comedy club, though his humor had taken on a desperate edge since his divorce. And Logan Hayes, quiet, steady Logan, had become our unofficial outdoorsman, the one who actually knew which end of a compass pointed north. We drove up from Minneapolis in Tyler's SUV, the autumn air crisp through cracked windows as we wound through increasingly remote highways. The Boundary Waters canoe area. Wilderness stretched before us like a promise. Over 1 million acres of pristine lakes and dense forest straddling the Minnesota-Canada border. No roads, no cell service, no escape from whatever was waiting for us out there. "Jesus, Tyler, you sure you know where we're going?" Chase asked as we turned onto yet another unmarked dirt road. Pine trees pressed in on both sides, their branches creating a tunnel of green-black shadow even in the afternoon light. Tyler consulted his GPS for the 100th time. Should be just ahead. The outfitter said to look for a wooden sign with a beaver carved on it. I was taking pictures through the passenger window, trying to capture the way the light filtered through the canopy in dusty shafts. Photography had become my refuge after things fell apart with Sarah. Something about freezing moments in time, making them permanent when everything else seemed to slip away. The trees here were different from the ones back home. Older, more patient, like they'd been watching the same spot for centuries, waiting for something specific to happen. There, Logan pointed ahead to a weather-beaten sign that read, "Ely Canoe Outfitters, Gateway to Adventure." A cartoon beaver grinned beside the words, its painted eyes faded but still somehow unsettling. The outfitter was exactly what you'd expect. A grizzled man named Earl with arms like tree trunks and the kind of deep tan that comes from decades of sun and wind. He looked us over with barely concealed skepticism as we loaded our rented canoes onto the roof racks. "You boys sure about heading to Basswood Lake?" he asked, scratching his gray beard. "Gets pretty isolated out there. Most folks prefer the easier routes closer to town." "We want isolated," Tyler said, checking items off his laminated list. "That's the whole point." Earl shrugged. Suit yourselves. Just remember, once you're past the first portage, ain't nobody gonna hear you holler. Radio's in the pack there, but it only works line of sight to the ranger station. 50 miles of nothing but trees and water between here and there. He handed Tyler a topo map, the paper soft with age and handling. Stick to the marked campsites. Some of the islands, well, let's just say the Ojibwe had their reasons for avoiding certain places. Old reasons. Chase laughed. What, like ancient burial grounds? Come on, old-timer. You'll have to do better than that to spook us city boys. Earl's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Ain't trying to spook nobody. Just giving you the same advice I'd give my own sons. He turned to Logan. You ever canoe the boundary waters before? A few times, Logan nodded. Know the basic safety protocols. Good, because the water's cold even in September, and hypothermia'll kill you faster than anything else out there. Earl's gaze lingered on each of us. Faster than most things, anyway. The drive to our put-in point took another hour along increasingly primitive roads. The GPS signal flickered and died somewhere past the last gas station, leaving us to navigate by Tyler's printed directions and the occasional Forest Service marker. By the time we reached the boat launch, the sun was already low, painting the water the color of old blood. Basswood Lake stretched before us like a mirror, its surface broken only by the occasional rise of a feeding fish. Islands dotted the expanse, some large enough to support towering pines, others just bare rock humps that barely cleared the waterline. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. All right, Tyler announced, consulting his map. Campsite 47 is about 3 miles northeast. Should be able to make it before dark if we paddle steady. We launched the canoes with more enthusiasm than skill. I paired with Chase in one canoe, while Tyler and Logan took the other. The water was so clear I could see the bottom 20 feet down, littered with fallen logs that looked like the bones of some massive creature. Fish moved in the depths like shadows, darting away from our passage. Man, this is beautiful, I said, snapping photos of the shoreline. Ancient cedars leaned over the water, their roots exposed where the bank had eroded. Everything was green and gold and timeless. Yeah, if you like the whole murder location aesthetic, Chase replied, but he was grinning. For all his jokes, he was starting to relax for the first time since the divorce papers were signed. The paddle to our campsite should have been straightforward. A simple northeast bearing across open water. But within an hour, I noticed something wrong with Tyler's navigation. The sun was setting behind us, which meant we were heading generally east. But according to the compass Tyler kept checking, we were somehow heading north, then northwest, then south. Hey, T, Chase called across the water. You sure about that compass? Tyler held up the device, frowning. The needle was spinning slowly, never settling on any particular direction. That's weird. It was working fine this morning. Logan leaned over to look. Even from our canoe 30 feet away, I could see his face go pale. That's not possible. Compasses don't just stop working. Must be some kind of magnetic anomaly, Tyler said, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. Iron deposits or something. We'll just follow the shoreline until we find the campsite. But the shoreline seemed to change as we paddled. Inlets appeared where none had been marked on the map. Islands shifted position when we weren't looking directly at them. What should have been a 3-mile trip stretched into the evening, the sun sinking lower as we searched for a campsite that didn't seem to exist. There, Logan finally said, pointing to a small bay. That has to be it. The campsite was a cleared area on a low bluff overlooking the water, surrounded by towering white pines. A fire ring made of blackened stones sat in the center, and a weathered picnic table leaned at a drunken angle under the trees. It didn't match the description on Tyler's reservation, but by then none of us cared. We were tired, confused, and eager to set up camp before full darkness fell. We hauled our gear up from the canoes in the gathering dusk. The forest around us was absolutely still. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, no wind in the branches. Just our own breathing and the soft lap of water against the rocky shore. Anyone else notice how quiet it is? I asked as we set up the tents. Peaceful, Tyler said, but he kept glancing over his shoulder as he worked. Chase was struggling with his tent stakes in the rocky soil. Peaceful like a graveyard. When's the last time any of you heard a bird? We all stopped what we were doing, listening. The silence was complete, oppressive. Even the water seemed to have stopped moving. Probably just the wrong time of day, Logan said quietly. Birds roost at dusk, but I'd been in the woods before. There should have been owls calling at least. Night insects. Something. Instead, the silence pressed against our eardrums like a physical weight. Tyler tried to lighten the mood as we gathered around the fire ring. Well, we wanted to get away from civilization. Mission accomplished. He struck a match and held it to the kindling Logan had prepared. The match flared and died. He tried again. Same result. Wood might be damp, Logan suggested, but when he felt it, the kindling was bone dry. Tyler used half a book of matches before he got even a small flame to catch. When it finally took, the fire burned with a strange blue undertone, casting weird shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. We cooked our first meal over that unnatural fire, canned chili and instant coffee that tasted like ash. The conversation was stilted, interrupted by long pauses as we found ourselves listening to the oppressive silence around us. Every so often, one of us would think we heard something, a branch breaking, footsteps, a whisper. But when we turned toward the sound, there was nothing there. So, Chase said, clearly forcing joviality, what's everyone's greatest fear out here? Getting eaten by bears, drowning, getting lost, getting stuck listening to your stand-up routine. Tyler shot back, but his heart wasn't in it. I was adjusting my camera settings, trying to capture the strange quality of our firelight. Getting separated, I said without thinking. Being alone out here. Logan nodded slowly. There's something about true wilderness that strips away all the pretense. Makes you realize how small you are. How temporary. Jesus, you guys are cheerful, Chase muttered, but he moved closer to the fire. The flames were definitely burning blue now, throwing an unnatural light that made our faces look corpse pale. I took a few shots, though I doubted they'd come out right. The camera seemed to be having trouble focusing, the autofocus hunting back and forth without ever finding a clear image. Maybe we should call it a night, Tyler suggested. Get an early start tomorrow. We were all exhausted from the long day and the stress of navigation problems. But as we prepared for bed, small things continued to go wrong. Logan's sleeping bag was damp despite being kept dry all day. Chase's backpack had somehow come unzipped, spilling half his clothes onto the ground. My camera battery showed empty even though I'd charged it the night before. This place is fucking with us, Chase said, trying to stuff his wet clothes back into his pack. It's just Murphy's Law, Tyler replied. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. We're tired and making mistakes. But I could see he didn't believe it either. We crawled into our tents around 10 o'clock. The fire reduced to glowing embers that still flickered with that unsettling blue tinge. I shared a two-man tent with Chase, who was snoring within minutes despite his earlier complaints about the spookiness of our campsite. I lay awake, listening. The silence outside was so complete it seemed to have weight. No insects, no water lapping the shore, no wind in the trees. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I heard the first whisper. It came from just outside our tent. So soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. A voice, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words seemed to flow like water with occasional clicks and stops that hurt to listen to. I held my breath, straining to hear. The voice came again, closer now, right next to my head, with only the thin nylon of the tent wall between us. "Chase," I whispered, shaking my tentmate's shoulder. He mumbled and rolled over without waking. The voice outside continued its strange monologue. I couldn't make out individual words, but there was something hypnotic about the rhythm, something that made me want to unzip the tent and go outside to see who was speaking. Instead, I lay frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. After what felt like hours, the whispers stopped. But then I heard something worse, the sound of our canoes being dragged across the rocks. "Chase," I hissed, shaking him harder. Wake up! This time he responded, groggy and irritated. What? What time is it? Someone's messing with our boats. Chase sat up, instantly alert. We could both hear it now, the unmistakable scrape of aluminum hulls against stone, growing fainter as whatever was taking them moved away from shore. Shit, Chase breathed. Tyler! Logan! We unzipped the tent and crawled out into the night. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in stark black and white. Tyler was already emerging from his tent, flashlight in hand. Where's Logan? I asked. Tyler's tent was a two-man model like ours, but only one sleeping bag was visible inside. Logan, Tyler called softly. You out here? No answer. We searched the campsite with our flashlights, calling Logan's name in increasingly loud whispers. His sleeping bag was cold to the touch, suggesting he'd been gone for some time. His boots were missing from outside the tent, but his jacket still hung from a tree branch where he'd left it. Maybe he went to take a leak, Chase suggested, but his voice was tight with worry. In the middle of the lake? Tyler pointed his flashlight toward the water. Both canoes were gone, nothing but disturbed gravel showing where they'd been pulled into the water. We spread out along the shoreline, sweeping the water with our lights. Nothing. The lake was black as oil, reflecting our flashlight beams like dead eyes. Logan! Tyler called out at full volume, his voice echoing off the water and dying in the trees. The sound came back to us distorted, as if the echoes were forming words in that same strange language I'd heard whispered outside my tent. This is bad, I said. We need to radio for help. Tyler retrieved the emergency radio from his pack, extending the antenna and cycling through channels. Static hissed from the speaker, broken occasionally by fragments of distant conversation that might have been in English or might have been in that same clicking, flowing tongue we'd heard in the echoes. Mayday, Mayday, Tyler spoke into the handset. This is Tyler Bailey at Basswood Lake Campsite 47. We have a missing person and no transportation. Please respond. Static. Mayday, this is Tyler Bailey. We need immediate assistance. Over. More static, and then... Tyler. We all froze. The voice coming from the radio was Logan's, but something was wrong with it. The tone was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. Logan, where are you? Are you okay? Tyler spoke rapidly into the radio. I'm fine, Tyler. I'm coming back now. Don't worry about the canoes. Where were you? Why did you take the boats? A long pause filled with static. Then, I needed to see something. I'll explain when I get back. The radio went dead. We waited on the shore, scanning the water for any sign of movement. The moon was setting, and the darkness seemed to deepen by degrees. Our flashlights carved weak cones of light across the water, but they couldn't penetrate more than a few yards into the black. There, Chase said, pointing. A single canoe was moving toward us across the lake, its occupant paddling with slow, steady strokes. In the moonlight, we could make out Logan's familiar silhouette. Thank God, Tyler breathed. But, as the canoe drew closer, something cold settled in my stomach. Logan's movements were too regular, too mechanical. He paddled without the slight variations that mark human motion, like a machine designed to mimic paddling rather than an actual person. The canoe ground against the rocky shore, and Logan stepped out. In the beam of Tyler's flashlight, he looked exactly the same as always. Sandy brown hair, lean build, the same clothes he'd worn to bed. But he didn't blink. Not once in the 30 seconds Tyler held a light on him. Where's the other canoe? Tyler asked. It sank, Logan replied in that same flat tone. Hit a snag and took on water. Jesus, Logan, you scared the hell out of us. Where did you go? Why didn't you wake anyone up? Logan stood perfectly still, water dripping from his boots. I heard something calling from the water. I thought it might be important. Calling? What kind of calling? I asked. Logan turned to look at me, and in the reflected glow of our flashlights I saw that his pupils were completely dilated. Black circles surrounded by the thinnest rim of iris, like he was staring into some impossible distance. Like voices, he said. Under the water. They knew my name. Chase laughed nervously. Voices under the water? Dude, you probably had a dream and went sleepwalking. I don't sleepwalk, Logan said. He was right. In all the years I'd known him, Logan was the soundest sleeper among us. He once slept through a fire alarm in our dorm. "Well, whatever happened, let's just be glad you're okay," Tyler said, clearly eager to move past the strangeness of the situation. "We lost radio contact with the outside and we're down to one canoe. We'll have to call for evacuation in the morning." Logan nodded, but the movement was wrong. Too sharp, like his neck was hinged rather than flexible. "That sounds wise." We returned to our tents, but none of us slept well. I lay awake listening to Chase's breathing and trying to convince myself that everything was normal. Logan was back, we had one canoe, and in the morning we'd paddled to the nearest ranger station for help. But Logan's words kept echoing in my head. They knew my name. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to the sound of someone moving around outside. Pale morning light filtered through the tent wall, and I could hear the whisper of footsteps on pine needles. "Chase," I whispered, but he was already awake, listening. We unzipped the tent flap and looked out. Logan was standing by the fire ring, perfectly motionless, staring out at the water. He was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, jeans and a flannel shirt that should have been soaked from his midnight paddle but appeared completely dry. "Morning, Logan," Chase called out cheerfully, clearly trying to maintain normal social rhythms. Logan didn't respond or acknowledge us in any way. He continued staring at the lake with unblinking eyes. Tyler emerged from his tent, looking haggard. "How long has he been standing there?" "Don't know. He was like that when we woke up." Tyler approached Logan cautiously. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Logan turned his head toward Tyler with that same too-sharp motion. When he spoke, his voice was different, higher pitched, like he was mimicking the sound of speech rather than actually speaking. "The water is beautiful this morning." We all looked at the lake. It was the same black mirror it had been the night before, giving no hint of the depths beneath. "Yeah," Tyler agreed slowly. "Very peaceful. Listen, we should probably get moving. Radio didn't work last night, so we need to paddle back to the outfitter." "We can't leave," Logan said. "Not yet. Why not?" "They're not finished with us." A chill ran down my spine. "Who's not finished with us?" Logan's head swiveled toward me with mechanical precision. "The ones under the water. The ones who live in the deep places. They've been waiting so long." Chase forced another laugh, but it came out high and strained. "Okay, Logan, very funny. You had us going there for a minute." "I'm not Logan," the thing wearing Logan's face replied matter-of-factly. The words hung in the morning air like smoke. None of us moved. None of us spoke. Then Tyler broke the spell. "Bullshit. Come on, man, quit screwing around. We need to pack up and get out of here." But I was studying Logan's face in the clear morning light, and the wrongness was becoming impossible to ignore. His skin had a waxy quality, like it was made of some substance that only approximated flesh. His hair lay perfectly flat despite having been soaked the night before. And his eyes, those black pupilled eyes, never tracked movement the way human eyes should. "Where's our friend?" I asked quietly. "Where's the real Logan?" The thing tilted its head like a curious bird. "He's safe. He's learning to breathe water." Tyler stepped back involuntarily. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means he's changing. Like I'm changing. Like you'll all change before this is finished." Chase grabbed a cast-iron skillet from our camp kitchen and held it like a weapon. "Stay back, whatever you are." The Logan thing laughed, and the sound was like wind through dead leaves. "You can't hurt this body. It's already dead." As if to demonstrate, it reached down and picked up a burning branch from our fire. A piece of wood that should have seared flesh instantly. The flames licked around its fingers without any sign of pain or damage. "See? This form is just borrowed. A shell to walk around in while the real work happens." Tyler was backing toward the remaining canoe. "We're leaving. Now." "You can't leave," the Logan thing said, beginning to follow us. "The lake won't let you." I looked out at the water and felt my heart sink. The lake, which had been roughly circular when we arrived, now stretched to the horizon in all directions. Islands that had been visible yesterday were gone. The shoreline behind us had vanished into mist. "That's impossible," Tyler whispered. "Geography is malleable here," the Logan thing explained patiently. "Space bends. Water flows uphill. The living learn to breathe in new ways. Chase swung the skillet at the thing's head. It connected with a wet thunk, and the Logan thing staggered. But when it straightened up, there was no damage, just a dent in the skull that slowly filled out as we watched. "Please don't do that," it said politely. "This body is still useful." I was taking pictures now, working on pure instinct. Through the camera lens, the Logan thing looked even more wrong. Its edges seemed to blur and shift as if it couldn't quite maintain a stable form. But more disturbing were the shadows around it. Even in the bright morning light, dark tendrils seemed to writhe at its feet like living things. "What do you want?" Tyler demanded. "To go home," the Logan thing replied. "I've been alone under the water for so long. But now there are enough of you to make the crossing possible." "Crossing to where?" "To the place beneath, where the water is thick as blood and the pressure would crush your bones if you still had bones to crush." Its voice was becoming layered now, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "Logan is already there, learning to sing in the deep harmonies." I lowered my camera and saw Chase and Tyler staring at me with expressions of growing horror. It took me a moment to realize why. When I looked at the LCD screen on the back of my camera, the photos showed not just the Logan thing, but dozens of figures standing around our campsite. Pale, waterlogged shapes with flowing hair and black eyes, all watching us with patient hunger. "They've been waiting for you to see them," the Logan thing said, following my gaze to the camera. "Physical eyes are so limited, but the camera sees more. It sees the spaces between light." I spun around, looking at our campsite with my naked eyes. Empty forest, morning shadows, our abandoned tents. But when I raised the camera again, they were everywhere, standing among the trees, emerging from the water, hovering at the edges of our vision. "Don't look at the screen," Tyler warned, but it was too late. Chase had grabbed the camera from my hands and was staring at the LCD display. "Oh, God," he whispered. "They're all around us." The Logan thing smiled, and for the first time the expression looked genuinely pleased. "Now you're beginning to understand. This place exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. What you call reality is just the thinnest layer, like ice over deep water." Chase dropped the camera and ran for the canoe. Tyler and I were right behind him, but the Logan thing didn't try to stop us. It just stood by the fire ring, watching with amusement as we dragged the aluminum canoe into the shallows. "It won't matter," it called after us. "The lake is hungry, and Logan is calling you from below." We paddled desperately away from shore, our strokes choppy and panicked. Behind us, the Logan thing grew smaller but no less disturbing. It waved goodbye with mechanical cheerfulness, and I could swear I heard it laughing even when we were a quarter mile from shore. "Where do we go?" Chase panted, his paddle cutting frantically through the black water. Tyler was consulting his compass, but the needle was spinning again. "I don't know. Nothing looks familiar." The lake stretched endlessly in all directions now, its surface broken only by the occasional tree that stood impossibly in the middle of deep water, its roots somehow anchored to nothing. The sun was directly overhead, but it gave off no warmth. The light had a flat, artificial quality that made everything look like a photograph. "There," I pointed to what might have been a shoreline in the distance. "We'll head for land and try to find a trail out." But as we paddled toward it, the shoreline seemed to recede like a mirage. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. The sun didn't move in the sky. Our position relative to the distant shore never changed despite our constant paddling. "We're not getting anywhere," Tyler finally admitted, letting his paddle drag in the water. Chase was looking increasingly frantic. "This is impossible. Lakes don't just expand like this." "The thing said geography was malleable here," I reminded them, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. "You believe that thing? It's not Logan. It's not even human." But I was thinking about the photos on my camera, about the figures we couldn't see with our eyes. Maybe the Logan thing was telling the truth about reality being layered, about this place existing in multiple dimensions. "We need to go back," Tyler said suddenly. Chase stared at him. "Back? Back to that thing? It's our only chance. Whatever's happening here started when Logan disappeared." Maybe if we figure out what happened to him. Logan's dead, Chase said flatly. That thing told us he's learning to breathe water. Learning to breathe water, Tyler. How does that sound to you? I was checking my camera, scrolling through the photos I'd taken. The images were getting stranger. In the most recent shots, the pale figures were closer, and some of them were starting to look familiar. One had Chase's jawline. Another had Tyler's distinctive nose. "Guys," I said quietly, "look at this." They huddled around the camera's LCD screen. In the photo, 3 figures stood in our canoe, but they weren't quite us. They were pale, waterlogged versions with black eyes and hair that moved as if underwater. "That's impossible," Tyler breathed. "We're right here." But even as he spoke, I could see the truth beginning to dawn on him. The same truth that was crystallizing in my own mind like ice forming on still water. "What if we're not?" I asked. "What if we drowned last night when we went after the canoes? What if this whole morning has been—" "No," Chase said firmly. "No, I'm not dead. I can feel the paddle in my hands. I can feel my heart beating." But his words lacked conviction. When I really concentrated, I couldn't feel my heartbeat either. I couldn't feel the sun on my skin or the slight breeze that should have been coming off the water. "The Logan thing said physical eyes are limited," I continued, the horrible logic becoming clearer. "What if we've been seeing what we expect to see? What if the camera is showing us the truth?" Tyler was staring at his hands. In the bright, sourceless light, his skin had the same waxy quality I'd noticed on the Logan thing. "How long have we been paddling?" "I don't know." "The sun hasn't moved." "Because there is no sun," Chase whispered. "There's no time here, no space. We're in the place between, aren't we?" As if summoned by his words, Logan's voice drifted across the water. But it was coming from below us, filtered up through fathoms of black water. "Come down," the voice called. "It's beautiful here. The pressure doesn't hurt once you stop fighting it." I leaned over the side of the canoe and peered into the depths. Far below, I could see lights moving. Not fish, but something organized, intentional. "Don't look," Tyler warned, but I couldn't help myself. The lights were rising, growing brighter as they approached the surface. And now I could see what they were. Figures swimming up from the deepest parts of the lake, their bodies glowing with the same pale luminescence as deep-sea creatures. Logan was among them, but he was changed. His hair flowed around his head like seaweed, and his eyes had gone completely black. When he opened his mouth to call to us again, water poured out instead of air. "We've been waiting for you," he said, his voice somehow carrying perfectly through the water between us. "The transition is easier if you don't fight it." "Transition to what?" Tyler called down to him. "To what we were always meant to be. The deep places have been calling to humanity for so long. Now it's time to answer." The other figures were circling beneath us now, and I could see that some of them had once been human. They wore the rotted remains of clothing, hiking boots, backpacks, pieces of modern outdoor gear. How many groups like ours had been drawn to this place over the years? How many had made the same journey from the world of air and sunlight to the crushing depths below? "The lake isn't just water," Logan continued. "It's a doorway, a place where the barriers between worlds grow thin. You've already passed through. Now you just need to let go of the illusion that you're still alive." As he spoke, I became aware of the weight of water in my lungs. The cold, crushing pressure that I'd been ignoring finally registered in my consciousness. Chase was making choking sounds beside me, his hands clutching at his throat. "I can't breathe," he gasped. "I can't. Oh, God, I can't breathe." But Tyler was laughing, a sound like bubbles breaking. "Of course we can't breathe. We're 40 feet underwater." I looked around with new eyes and saw the truth. We weren't in a canoe on the surface of a lake. We were sinking through black water, our bodies heavy and lifeless, our clothes dragging us down into the depths where Logan and the others waited. The canoe was just the memory of floating, the last desperate fiction our minds had created to avoid accepting death. But the illusion was breaking apart now, dissolving like mist. Chase fought it until the end, clawing at the water as if he could somehow swim back to life. But Tyler and I let ourselves sink, understanding finally that resistance was pointless. We'd drowned the night before, when we'd gone after the canoes. Everything since then had been the elaborate death dream of drowning minds. Logan swam up to meet us as we descended, his transformed face peaceful in the strange, sourceless light of the deep. "Welcome home," he said, and the water carried his words directly into our changing minds. I wanted to ask him how long we'd been dead, how long we'd wandered the surface world without realizing we were already gone, but I found I could no longer remember what questions were or why they had ever seemed important. The pressure should have crushed us, but we were beyond pressure now, beyond breath, beyond heartbeat, beyond the tyranny of physics that governed the world above. We swam deeper into trenches that had no bottom, past forests of pale coral that grew in impossible formations. Other figures joined us in the depths, people who had made the same transition over the years. Some had been dead for decades, though time meant nothing here. They welcomed us with the patient kindness of those who had learned to embrace their new existence. We made homes in the deepest places, where the water was thick as oil and strange lights moved like stars. We learned new ways to communicate, new forms of beauty that didn't depend on light or air. We became something more than human, something adapted to pressures and depths that surface dwellers could never imagine. Sometimes, on certain nights when the barriers grew thin, we would rise to the shallow places near the surface. We would call to the living who paddled their small boats across our domain, sharing with them the same invitation we had received. Some listened. Some came down to join us in the crushing embrace of the deep. Others fled, carrying stories of strange encounters on remote lakes. They would speak of missing friends, of companions who disappeared in the night and returned changed. The living rarely believed these stories, just as we had once dismissed Earl's warnings about places the Ojibwe avoided. But we were patient. The deep places had been calling to humanity for millennia. Each year, a few more answered. And in our transformed state, we finally understood that this had always been our destiny. The surface world was just a temporary stage, a brief pause before the real journey began. Down here, in the crushing darkness where water became blood and pressure became ecstasy, we had found our true home. I tried to remember what sunlight felt like, what it was like to breathe air instead of the thick, life-giving waters of the deep. But those memories faded like dreams, becoming less real with each passing moment. They belonged to creatures we had once been, in a world we had transcended. The only thing that remained from our old lives was the knowledge that others would follow. They would come to the lakes and rivers that served as doorways, drawn by the same restless yearning that had brought us here. They would hear our voices calling from beneath the water, inviting them to shed their heavy flesh and join us in the endless depths. And when they finally stopped fighting the water filling their lungs, when they let themselves sink into our waiting embrace, we would welcome them with the same patient joy Logan had shown us. Because the deep places are always hungry, and we are always waiting.